I will not wait for what will never come, Clara whispered to the winter wind as she stepped onto the frost-covered path leading away from Whitmore Estate, her gloved hands clutching the edges of her woolen cloak as snowflakes swirled around her like tiny shards of glass. The carriage behind her remained silent, its horses pawing at the frozen ground, impatient in the gathering dusk. Each breath she drew hung in the air, a visible reminder of her determination and the cold that seeped into her bones. Across the expanse of snow-dusted fields, the silhouette of the distant manor loomed like a shadow from another life, the flicker of lamplight through tall windows offering a faint warmth she no longer sought. Her thoughts lingered on the countless moments she had given, the letters left unanswered, the eyes that had passed over her as if she were invisible, and yet tonight, for the first time in years, she felt the strange lightness of release. Nathaniel Drake, the Duke, had not seen her leave. Perhaps he would never know, and perhaps that was precisely the point. She pulled her cloak tighter around her slender frame, the fabric absorbing the chill while her mind traced the delicate lines of the portrait he had once sent her, a reminder of a connection that had been offered too late, or perhaps never at all. The crunch of her boots against the hard-packed snow echoed in the emptiness, each step a deliberate choice, a quiet rebellion against the life she had been expected to lead. Memories surfaced unbidden. The evening she had stood at the balcony, waiting for a shadow to appear in the corridor, the briefest glimmer of hope each time a letter arrived, only to be met with cold indifference. She recalled the way his eyes had flickered once, the hesitation in his hand as he considered reaching for her, but always stopping, always retreating into the fortress of his own pride. Now, as Clara pressed forward, the wind whipping strands of auburn hair across her pale face, she felt the tension that had gripped her heart loosen, replaced by a quiet clarity. She would no longer be the lady who waited. She would be the lady who chose, who acted, who walked away with dignity intact. Behind her, the estate receded into darkness, the smoke from chimneys curling upward in the last rays of sunlight, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and distant gardens she had once wandered with naive trust. Each step forward was measured, deliberate, a rhythm in tune with her heartbeat, which thrummed not with fear, but with the strange exhilaration of freedom. The frozen trees lining the path cast long shadows, intricate as lace, their skeletal branches reaching toward the twilight sky, and Clara's thoughts drifted to the moment when Nathaniel would finally comprehend what had been lost, the emptiness that would creep into the grand halls he ruled, the silence where her laughter and presence had once filled the rooms. The snow beneath her feet deepened, brushing the hems of her skirts as she moved with purpose, and she allowed herself a single glance backward, seeing the last glimmer of light from the estate fade into night, a symbol of the past she had left behind. Her breath came steady now, mingling with the cold air, each exhale a visible statement of resolve. She would walk on through the winter fields, past the skeletal fences and frozen fountains, through the quiet that stretched over miles, until the world she chose became real. In that distance, the Duke would stand, perhaps watching, perhaps realizing too late the weight of what he had let slip away, and in that realization, Clara found the peace that years of longing had denied her. Every flake of snow that settled on her cloak seemed to echo her heartbeat, steady, unyielding, a rhythm that spoke of endings and beginnings intertwined, of dignity reclaimed and lessons hard-earned, and as the night deepened, the stars appeared faintly above, cold and distant yet steadfast, mirroring the quiet triumph in her chest, a triumph not over him, but over the shadow that had once held her captive. And Clara Whitmore walked on into the darkened fields, unafraid, resolute, and finally, free. The wind had risen as Clara Whitmore pressed forward through the undulating snowdrifts, each step measured and careful, her boots leaving crisp imprints in the frozen ground that stretched endlessly beneath the fading light. The distant outline of the northern woods appeared like a phantom, dark and still, their bare branches etched against the gray sky, as if guarding the secrets of a world she had just stepped out from. Clara's thoughts lingered on the cold grandeur of Whitmore Estate, the manor's stone walls looming behind her, casting long shadows across the fields she once walked with the hope of recognition, now gone, replaced by resolve. Her breath formed small clouds in the bitter air, and with every exhale, she felt a growing clarity, a rhythm in tune with her own heartbeat that urged her onward. The path ahead was winding, lined by ancient fences half buried in snow, and as she navigated the uneven terrain, the frozen landscape seemed to echo her solitude, the silence only broken by the occasional rustle of a distant owl or the soft hiss of the wind over the ridges. She thought of Nathaniel Drake, his name carrying the weight of missed chances and unspoken words, the memory of his hands lingering in her mind though they had never truly reached for hers. Each step took her further from expectation and closer to autonomy. The rhythm of her movement a quiet assertion that she would no longer wait for acknowledgement or affection that was withheld. Clara's cloak flared slightly with the gusts, a vivid streak of deep sapphire against the white expanse, her figure moving with deliberate grace as if the snow itself dared not impede her passage. The last rays of sun caught on the distant icicles hanging from the northern ridges, scattering light across the frozen ground and casting brief, ephemeral reflections that danced like fragments of the life she left behind. Her eyes, steadfast and resolute, scanned the horizon, tracing the faint line where sky met snow, and she let her mind wander to the times she had stood within those grand halls, the echo of unspoken conversations still clinging to the carved wood and cold marble. With every step, she felt the tension of years of hope and disappointment unravel, replaced by a steadfast courage she had not known she possessed. The quiet of the approaching night wrapped around her like a mantle, heavy yet protective, and she felt a subtle thrill in the control she now held over her own destiny. Ahead, the path narrowed, bordered by frost-laden trees whose skeletal branches interlaced overhead, forming a cathedral of ice that filtered the fading light into fractured beams dancing upon the snow. Clara's hands, clad in fine leather gloves, brushed against the tips of branches as she moved, the tactile sensation grounding her in the reality of this chosen freedom. Somewhere beyond the nearest ridge, the sound of a distant bell carried faintly, a reminder of the world she had departed, the social expectations she had shed with every measured stride. She allowed herself a moment to pause, lifting her gaze to the heavens where the first stars pierced the twilight, cold points of light mirrored by the determination burning within her chest. There was no turning back. Each breath was a testament to her resolve, each footprint a declaration that she would no longer exist merely in anticipation of recognition. The night crept closer, folding the landscape into shadows that softened the horizon and cloaked the fields in quiet solitude, and Clara Whitmore walked steadily onward, guided by the rhythm of her own heart and the promise of a freedom she would not surrender. The cold had deepened as Clara Whitmore continued along the snow-blanketed path, the moon now casting a pale silver glow that shimmered across the undisturbed fields and icy branches. Each step was deliberate, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, powdery snow that crunched beneath her weight, and the rhythmic sound became a subtle companion to the quiet beat of her heart. The distant silhouette of a frozen pond came into view, its surface smooth and reflective, catching the light of the stars and scattering it like fragments of forgotten memories. Clara paused for a moment, her breath forming delicate clouds that danced briefly before dissipating into the night air, and she traced her gloved fingers over the edge of her cloak, feeling the warmth she had layered against the relentless cold. Thoughts of Whitmore Estate lingered in her mind, not with longing but with a careful detachment, the grand halls and ornate chandeliers now symbols of the life she had chosen to leave behind. She recalled the soft whispers of servants, the faint echo of music from distant ballrooms, and the fleeting glimpses of Nathaniel Drake's presence, always just beyond reach, always too late to offer comfort or recognition. The wind swept through the open fields, carrying with it the crisp scent of pine from the bordering woods, and it whispered around her as though encouraging her onward, guiding her away from the shadows of expectation that had once constrained her. Her gaze lifted to the horizon, where a line of dark evergreens created a natural barrier between the fields and the distant hills, and she felt a quiet surge of determination, a sense of purpose solidifying within her chest. Each step forward felt like a statement, a silent assertion of independence that required no acknowledgement, no validation from those she had once hoped would notice her. The snow deepened in patches, brushing against the hems of her skirts and adding weight to each stride. Yet she moved with a rhythm that was steady and unyielding, a measured cadence in harmony with the clarity she had gained from years of patient endurance. Clara's mind wandered briefly to the moments of hesitation she had once seen in Nathaniel, the almost imperceptible pause in his gestures, the faintest shadow of recognition in his eyes that never fully materialized, and she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile at the memory, for it no longer held power over her. The trees on either side of the path reached high, their bare branches forming intricate patterns against the starlit sky, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended in time, a serene expanse that reflected the resolve now steadying her own heartbeat. Clara adjusted her cloak once more, tucking the edges securely against her shoulders as she walked, and the cold air seemed less biting, tempered by the warmth of her own determination. In the distance, the first hints of dawn began to pale the edges of the horizon, softening the night and promising the subtle light of a new day. And Clara Whitmore continued on, her steps unwavering, guided by the certainty that the life she was forging ahead was hers alone, unbound by the past, unshadowed by what had been lost, and illuminated by the quiet strength that she carried with each deliberate stride across the winter landscape. The first hints of morning light stretched across the horizon, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of pale gold and soft rose, and Clara Whitmore walked steadily, her breath forming small clouds that drifted upward before dissolving into the crisp air. Each step carried her further from the distant silhouette of the manor, and yet the memory of the estate clung to her thoughts like a faint perfume, lingering but no longer binding her. The trees lining the path stood like sentinels, their frost-coated branches glimmering in the soft dawn light, and the world seemed hushed, the silence wrapping around her as though the landscape itself honored her resolve. Clara's fingers brushed against the edges of her cloak, feeling the sturdy fabric against her skin, and with every measured step, a rhythm built in harmony with the quiet determination in her chest. She recalled the countless evenings she had spent pacing the halls of Whitmore Estate, waiting for a sign, a glance, any acknowledgement from Nathaniel Drake, and she allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile at the memory, for those moments now belonged to a past she had relinquished. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint crispness of melting snow from the higher ridges, and Clara inhaled deeply, letting the chill fill her lungs and strengthen the resolve that guided her forward. The path wound through a grove where the snow lay thick and undisturbed, muffling each footfall and giving the world a serene, almost sacred quality. She thought of the nights she had sat by the window, watching shadows stretch across the frozen gardens, each shadow a reminder of expectations unmet and words left unspoken. With every step, she felt the lingering tension of those years ease slightly, replaced by a quiet confidence that she had claimed for herself, a sense of autonomy that made the biting cold almost welcome, sharpening her awareness of every detail in the landscape around her. Clara's gaze swept across the distant horizon, where the sun's early rays touched the icy tips of evergreens, scattering light in fractured patterns across the snow, and she felt a subtle thrill at the beauty of a world observed freely, without the weight of imposed attentions or unreciprocated regard. The snow deepened in patches, brushing against the hems of her skirts, but she moved with grace and purpose, each stride deliberate, a testament to the quiet strength she had nurtured in the shadows of disappointment. She recalled the briefest flickers of hesitation she had once seen in Nathaniel Drake, the almost imperceptible moments when his eyes lingered, and she acknowledged them now without yearning, recognizing the truth of their inadequacy and embracing the certainty of her own choices. The sky brightened gradually, soft pastels giving way to a clearer blue, and the faint outline of distant hills appeared more defined, signaling the approach of a day that belonged entirely to her. Clara adjusted her cloak, tucking the edges firmly as she walked, and the rhythm of her steps seemed to echo the steady beat of her own heart, a declaration of freedom and self-possession that required no witness. In the stillness of the dawn, the snow reflecting the gentle light, she moved forward with unwavering determination, each footfall a marker of the path she had chosen, guided by the certainty of her own strength and the promise of a life unbound by the past, until the world around her became a canvas for the freedom she had claimed, and Clara Whitmore walked on, her presence alone enough to define the vast, silent landscape she traversed. The landscape gradually changed as Clara Whitmore continued across the snow-blanketed fields, the frost glinting like scattered crystals beneath the pale morning sun, and the air was filled with the quiet hush of a world untouched, the soft crunch of her boots the only sound marking her passage. The distant hills rose gently against the horizon, their contours softened by layers of snow that reflected the light in shimmering patterns, and Clara's eyes followed the undulating terrain with calm precision, her mind attuned to the rhythm of her own determined steps. Each breath she drew was visible in the cold air, a fleeting cloud that dissipated almost immediately, and with every exhale, she felt a growing awareness of her independence, a certainty that she was moving forward into a life she would shape entirely for herself. The trees at the edge of the path stood like guardians, their bare branches etched in frost, casting long shadows that stretched across the pristine snow, and Clara moved between them with careful grace, mindful of the uneven ground beneath her skirts. She recalled the long nights within Whitmore Estate, the golden light spilling across polished floors and the echoes of unspoken words, and she recognized that those memories now held a different weight, less of longing and more of lessons quietly learned. The wind shifted, carrying the crisp scent of pine and the faint tang of ice, brushing against her face and reminding her that the world was vast, cold, and alive with possibility. As she moved, the snow deepened in places, brushing against the hems of her cloak, but she navigated each step with deliberate composure, each movement reinforcing the inner strength that had grown in the shadow of disappointment and restraint. Clara's thoughts briefly wandered to Nathaniel Drake, the Duke, and she considered the fleeting hesitation in his gestures, the moments he had almost reached for her, now rendered insignificant by her own resolute decision to no longer wait for acknowledgement. The sun continued its ascent, scattering soft light across frozen ponds and windswept ridges, and the reflections glimmered like fragments of the life she had left behind, beautiful yet unreachable. Her breath remained steady, and the cadence of her footsteps matched the quiet heartbeat of her resolve, echoing softly in the stillness of the winter morning. Clara adjusted the collar of her cloak, the wool pressing firmly against her shoulders, and she felt a subtle thrill in the command she held over her own path, a freedom earned through patience and perseverance. The sky above shifted to a clearer blue, the first clouds of the day tinged with the warm hues of sunlight, and she allowed herself to notice the delicate interplay of light and shadow on the snow, a quiet spectacle that mirrored the balance she had reclaimed in her life. Every detail of the frozen fields, from the delicate frost on branches to the distant glimmer of the hills, seemed to affirm the choice she had made, the life she would now walk with steadfast dignity. Clara Whitmore pressed on, her steps unwavering, guided by the certainty of her own strength and the promise of a world she could finally inhabit on her own terms, each stride a testament to the quiet power she had cultivated and the freedom she carried within her chest as she moved through the vast, silent expanse of winter's embrace. By the time the morning sun had climbed above the eastern ridge, Whitmore Estate had awakened to a silence too precise to be natural, a silence that moved through its corridors like cold water beneath sealed doors. Servants crossed the polished halls with lowered voices, their footsteps softened by long Persian runners, their eyes lifting now and then toward the grand staircase, as though waiting for a sound that did not come. In the library, where the fire had been built high against the winter chill, Duke Nathaniel Drake stood before the tall windows with a letter unopened in his hand, and a restlessness he could not name tightening slowly beneath his waistcoat. He had risen before dawn, as was his habit, expecting the house to obey its old rhythms. The rustle of morning trays, the distant turn of carriage wheels, the quiet presence of Clara Whitmore somewhere at the edge of his awareness, dignified and patient, never demanding more than the courtesy he had so often failed to give. But the house felt altered, emptier, as if a portrait had been removed from a wall and only the pale outline remained. His steward, Mr. Alden, entered with the careful expression of a man carrying unwelcome truth. "Your Grace," he said, pausing near the threshold. Miss Whitmore departed before first light. Nathaniel did not turn at once. The words seemed too ordinary for the cold they released into the room. Departed. Not retired. Not delayed. Departed. His fingers tightened around the letter until the heavy paper bent sharply beneath his glove. To where? His voice remained controlled, but the stillness after it betrayed him. Mr. Alden lowered his eyes. "She left no full direction, Your Grace. Only a note for the household accounts and instructions that the winter charity ledgers be delivered to Mrs. Hargrove in town. She settled every matter before she went." Something in Nathaniel's chest shifted, not pain exactly, not yet, but the first dull pressure of recognition. Settled every matter. Clara had not fled in disorder. She had not acted from impulse. She had prepared, quietly, completely, without asking his permission, without seeking his notice, without leaving him the dignity of being warned. He turned then, and the morning light caught the hard line of his face, the dark hair at his temples, the gray eyes that had once made men in Parliament lower their voices and women in drawing rooms adjust their gloves. Yet there, in that cold library, his authority found no object upon which to rest. "Did anyone see her go?" he asked. "The stable boy, Your Grace." He said she refused the closed carriage and took the eastern path on foot until the road cleared beyond the ridge. She carried one traveling case. One case. Nathaniel looked past the steward to the chair Clara had favored during winter meetings, the one nearest the smaller hearth, where she had spent evenings correcting charity petitions in a hand so neat it seemed almost prayerful. He remembered passing her there weeks ago, candlelight touching her pale cheek and auburn hair as she lifted her eyes, waiting perhaps for a word. He had given her none. There had always been time, he had thought. Time to explain his restraint. Time to acknowledge her gentleness. Time to untangle the old grief that made tenderness feel like surrender. "Leave me," he said quietly. Mr. Alden bowed and withdrew, and the door closed with a soft click that sounded final. Nathaniel crossed the room with measured steps and stopped beside Clara's abandoned desk. No ribbon lay out of place. No drawer remained open. Even absence, in her hands, had manners. Upon the blotter rested a single pressed white camellia. Brittle at the edges, the flower he had sent months ago after failing to attend the winter supper where she had waited through 3 courses and smiled for every guest. He had believed the gift sufficient. He had been a fool. His hand hovered over the flower but did not touch it. Outside, wind swept snow from the stone ledge, and beyond the glass, faint footprints crossed the far field toward the line of black trees. Nathaniel stared at them until they blurred before his eyes, each mark a quiet accusation, each fading step proof that Clara Whitmore had not disappeared suddenly from his life. She had been leaving for years, one unanswered hope at a time, and he had only noticed when the door had already closed behind her. The afternoon light had softened, casting a golden haze across the frozen fields as Nathaniel Drake remained at the window, motionless, the pressed camellia still in his hand, and for the first time, he allowed the weight of absence to settle fully upon him. Outside, the snow shimmered in the soft glow, each flake reflecting the light like fragments of clarity he had failed to perceive, and he realized that every moment he had delayed, every hesitation born of pride and fear, had drawn her further into the world she had claimed for herself. The library felt suddenly vast and hollow, the high ceilings amplifying the silence of her departure, and Nathaniel's gaze fell upon the hearth where her chair still stood, neat and empty, a testament to her order, her precision, and her unspoken standards of dignity. He moved slowly across the room, the letter in his hand trembling faintly as he read her final instructions again, absorbing the meticulous care she had taken even in leaving, ensuring that no burden, no unfinished duty would remain behind for him to discover in anger or regret. The corners of the room caught the fading light, tracing lines of shadow across the polished floorboards, and Nathaniel followed them with a somber awareness, recalling the times he had dismissed her patience, overlooked the small gestures that marked her worth, and taken her quiet loyalty as a matter of course rather than a rare treasure. Outside, the wind whispered through the blackened branches of the surrounding woods, carrying a hint of frost and pine, and he felt a hollow ache that spread slowly through his chest, a recognition not of her absence alone, but of what he had lost by failing to see the subtle strength she had always offered. He approached the table where her gloves had been left, still folded neatly, as if she had simply stepped aside for a moment rather than vanished from his life entirely. And he traced the edge of the leather, feeling the faint impressions of her fingers and the care with which she had maintained even small items of her life. The letter on the desk bore instructions for the household, for the winter charity ledgers, for the deliveries to Mrs. Hargrove, all precise and devoid of complaint, and Nathaniel understood that she had exercised control over her world with a quiet, unwavering authority that he had never fully respected until it was irrevocably gone. The room felt colder now, though the fire still glowed, and he drew a deep breath, the air filling his lungs as if to steady him, though it did little to stem the surge of realization, the bitter clarity that each opportunity he had ignored, each kindness he had failed to acknowledge, had accumulated into a loss he could not retrieve. He stepped to the window again, and his eyes followed the faint trail of footprints in the distant snow, leading over the ridge and fading into the wilderness, proof of her deliberate distance, her careful measure, and the self-possession he had too long overlooked. Nathaniel remained there, motionless, absorbing the quiet lessons she had left behind, understanding at last that freedom, dignity, and strength were not gifts he could command or take, but qualities she carried inherently. And as the wind whispered through the bare branches outside, brushing the frost against the glass in a soft chorus, he felt the full gravity of the life she had claimed beyond his reach, and the silent echo of what he had failed to cherish until it was beyond recall. By late afternoon, Nathaniel Drake ordered his horse brought to the eastern gate, not with the commanding sharpness that usually sent servants hurrying, but with a quiet urgency that made the stable boy stare before bowing and running across the yard. The sky had turned the color of burnished pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the fields beyond Whitmore estate lay pale and endless, marked only by the faint, diminishing trail Clara Whitmore had left behind. Nathaniel rode without an escort, his dark coat drawn close against the wind, his gloved hands steady on the reins, though something inside him had ceased to feel steady at all. Each mile stretched before him like a question he had no right to answer. The road dipped past the frozen pond, climbed toward the northern ridge, then descended into the narrow valley where pines crowded the path, and the air smelled of ice, bark, and approaching dusk. He saw what she must have seen. The long fences half buried in snow, the skeletal branches arching overhead, the bleak beauty of a world that offered no comfort, yet somehow had received her more honestly than he had. The thought struck deeper than the cold. Near the small town of Bellwether, 5 miles from the estate, he slowed his horse at the sight of lamplight glowing through the windows of Mrs. Hargrove's charity house, a plain brick building beside the chapel yard where smoke curled gently from a narrow chimney. Voices carried faintly through the winter air, soft, purposeful, alive. Nathaniel dismounted beneath an old elm and stood in the shadows, his breath visible as he looked through the frosted glass. Clara was inside. She had removed her cloak, and candlelight rested upon her auburn hair and pale face as she bent over a table covered with ledgers, folded blankets, and baskets of winter bread. Mrs. Hargrove stood beside her, nodding as Clara explained something with calm precision, one gloved finger marking a line in the accounts. A little girl in a patched wool dress leaned close to Clara's side, listening as if Clara were not a discarded hope from a duke's household, but the surest authority in the room. Nathaniel remained outside, arrested by the sight. There was no despair in her posture, no theatrical sorrow, no invitation for rescue. She looked tired, yes, but not broken. She looked necessary. He had seen her beauty before and failed to understand it. Now he saw her usefulness, her steadiness, the quiet architecture of a life built from service and self-command, and the realization humbled him more than any public defeat ever could. When the chapel bell rang once in the twilight, Clara lifted her eyes toward the window, and for one suspended second, Nathaniel believed she saw him. The candlelight flickered between them, trembling against the glass. Her expression did not change. She simply returned to the ledger, placed the pressed ribbon marker between its pages, and handed the book to Mrs. Hargrove with a small, composed smile. That smile was not for him. It was not against him. It existed beyond him. Nathaniel felt the truth settle with terrible gentleness. She had not left to wound him, and that made the loss harder to bear. She had left because her soul could no longer survive by standing at the door of his silence. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then steadier, blurring the edges of the town, softening the chapel stones, whitening the shoulders of his coat as he stood motionless beneath the elm. He could enter. He could speak. He could ask her to return. But for the first time in all his titled life, Nathaniel understood that wanting was not the same as deserving, and regret was not a key that opened every door. Inside, Clara Whitmore moved from table to table, carrying warmth where winter had gathered, and outside, the Duke who had once believed time belonged to him watched the woman he had lost become fully herself without him. The night had settled fully over the northern fields, stars faintly visible through the thin veil of clouds as Clara Whitmore finished her work at Mrs. Hargrove's charity house and gathered the folded blankets, the ledgers, and small parcels she had arranged for the town families. Her movements were precise, deliberate, unhurried, each action a reflection of the quiet authority she had claimed over her own life. Outside, the snow lay thick and untouched, reflecting the dim glow of lanterns hung along the walkways, and a thin wind carried the scent of pine and winter frost through the air. Nathaniel Drake remained at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, silent and still, his coat dusted with fine snowflakes that melted against the dark fabric. He had followed at a distance, unsure if pursuit could alter the steady certainty of her chosen path, but compelled by the recognition of what he had lost, the finality of her departure, and the grace with which she had executed it. Clara adjusted the heavy collar of her cloak, the fabric pressing comfortably against her shoulders, and she glanced briefly toward the darkened tree-line, sensing the presence that had remained unseen yet profoundly felt all day. She did not turn, did not speak, but continued her careful work, arranging supplies, folding blankets, and stacking parcels with the quiet efficiency that had always marked her character. Nathaniel's eyes tracked her every movement, noting the careful balance of strength and gentleness in her gestures, the way her auburn hair caught the lantern light and framed a face that had never asked for indulgence yet had always commanded respect. He remembered the winters spent in the manor, the evenings when she had waited silently while he allowed moments to pass without acknowledgement, and a hollow ache tightened in his chest, a slow, steady weight of recognition that came too late. The small girl nearby, bundled in layers, looked up at Clara with trust and admiration, unaware of the complicated history between her and the figure who lingered in the shadows, and Nathaniel realized that Clara's worth was manifest in her actions, in the lives she touched, and not in the approval he had withheld. A soft gust of wind shifted the snow along the walkway, and Nathaniel stepped closer, careful to keep the distance, his eyes never leaving hers, seeking a sign, any sign that she might look upon him as she once had in the grand halls. Clara paused for a moment, her gloved hands resting on the stack of blankets, and though she did not turn, the faint tilt of her head suggested awareness, a recognition of presence without invitation. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, the cold air visible as a thin cloud, and understood fully that she had chosen her life independently, that her value had never depended on him, and that the lessons he had failed to learn in the quiet halls of the estate now rang clear in the open air of the winter evening. He remained there, watching the strength and composure in her movements, the careful consideration of every step, and felt the weight of his own inaction, the long months of overlooking kindness and steadiness, and knew that while he could follow, he could not reclaim what she had already claimed for herself. The lanterns flickered in the distance, casting gentle shadows across the snow, and Clara Whitmore moved with deliberate purpose toward the small village paths beyond the yard, carrying warmth, resolve, and quiet dignity into the night, leaving Nathaniel Drake to contemplate the distance between desire and possession, between recognition and loss, and to accept at last that some hearts only learn to beat again when they are met with the right hands at the right time.